Eu mandei pro YouTube. No som. Vou achar na minha timeline, duas pessoas vão ver. E as duas estão aqui. Minha mãe vai dar like.
So, it's a pleasure to have... Oi, gente. Boa tarde. Aqui, aqui, câmera, né? So, it's a pleasure to have here Tom Richards, that is coming... actually, he was here for the Música Estranha Festival, and he did a workshop and a concert, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Vanessa De Michelis, that is a very good friend of mine, and she's in touch with us, especially because the Sonora, this network that we have, it's about feminism and musics, and it's very important to me and to her. Start to build this kind of effect network that is more important than to get in touch because of the equipment or because of the wires and because of the electricity, but because of something that we really believe. So I just want to remember that at the beginning of Sonora, we have, I was mentioning to Tom earlier, that we have some listening series sessions. And one of the first ladies that we were listening to it was Daphne Oram, so it's coincidence, very happy. Então, bem-vindos e bem-vindas. O Tom vai fazer uma apresentação sobre a Daphne Oram e o Oramics, que é esse projeto, ele vai explicar melhor. E se vocês tiverem alguma dúvida ou problema com o inglês, eu pedi para o Tom falar um pouco mais devagar, mas a gente pode parar, e ele pediu para que vocês parassem quando for necessário e assim que quiserem. Não entendi, aí ele volta. Tá bom? So, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks Lillian. And hello, and lovely to see so many people here. So yeah, I'm Tom Richards. I'm an artist primarily. I trained in art, and I sort of moved sideways into music, and I build my own instruments and play kind of electronic music. But between 2011 and 2016, I was doing my PhD on the work of Daphne Oram. And so just before that time in the UK, some researchers had found this amazing machine that she'd created, and they tracked it down, and they arranged for it to be purchased by the Science Museum in London, and they also managed to raise some money for someone to come and research her machine and her archive. And luckily for me, they chose me for this studentship. So that was really changed my life and how I think about music and how I think about women in music and all of this stuff. So it's been an amazing opportunity. So I'm not going to really talk about myself today. I'm just going to talk about Daphne Oram and what I found out doing this study between University of Goldsmiths and the Science Museum in London. So I'll start at the beginning. Daphne Oram was born in a small town in the English countryside in 1925. She had 2 older brothers who, and as a family, they were very curious, and the older brothers were kind of always playing with electronics and science kits, and so Daphne Oram had this early influence of kind of technology in her life, and also her mother was a very accomplished musician, a pianist, so she from a very early age had all of these things in her life. So when she was only 18 years old, she moved to London in the middle of World War II in 1944, and she took a job at the BBC as a music balancer, or a sort of junior studio engineer, basically. and this basically was only possible because it was World War II, and the young men who may have taken this job were all off fighting the war. So it was kind of, in a way, lucky for her to be able to take this role. So in this job, she learnt all the basics of sound production, really sound recording, microphones, oscilloscopes, and initially she would be working with vinyl records a lot for broadcast, and then later, as magnetic tape technology developed, she worked a lot with magnetic tape, and Oram kind of went above and beyond in her job and her duties. So she took it upon herself to read and learn everything she could about electronic sound. It was really a passion and an interest for her, and she started to work outside of her job hours, outside of her allocated hours, and she would use the BBC equipment, and she would start to make compositions and experiments with magnetic tape. She read everything by Pierre Schaeffer from Paris and the Musique Concrète school, and she soon became really a master of tape manipulation. In 1948, she wrote an experimental orchestral piece called Still Point, which was a piece for pre-recorded orchestra, live orchestra, microphones, and reverberation treatments. It was a very early experimental work which she entered for the Prix de Rome, which was a composition prize, but she was turned down because nobody could understand the score, and possibly, I think possibly because she was a woman and young, and she was only about 25. But I'm going to come back to that in a bit. So while she was kind of gaining these skills in tape manipulation and sound production, she was also kind of asking her management at the BBC, well, this is the thing that's happening in Europe, in America, this electronic sound, we should be, she was putting pressure on her managers to be able to have more facilities with electronic sound, and unfortunately the BBC music department, who created most of the music for TV and radio, were very opposed to electronic music because they were very conservative, and they also thought maybe it's if we have electronic music, then we'll have to get rid of all of the acoustic musicians and players. So they were very sort of suspicious, and they were not into it at all. But luckily for Daphne Oram, what happened was some of the experimental drama producers became very interested in what she was doing. And so it was in the drama department that she really found a bit of support from a couple of producers, not everybody, but and so I think it was 1957, the first BBC broadcast of electronic sound was by Daphne Oram, a TV show called Amphitryon 38, which I think it was a sci-fi. And then shortly afterwards there was an experimental radio drama called Private Dreams and Public Nightmares by Frederick Bradnam, which is, I think that's on YouTube, so it's worth having a listen. You can hear that piece, I think. It's really remarkable kind of for such sort of early work. And whilst Oram was starting to develop this reputation as being an expert in electronic sound, people outside of the BBC started to take an interest, and she started to do soundtracks, experimental soundtracks for theatre productions, and also she started to sort of give lecture performances about the possibilities of electronic sound, demonstrating different techniques and some of her compositions. So this is a photo from the Edinburgh Festival, which is a big cultural festival in the UK and Scotland. This next slide is a review of that festival, and I don't know how it translates, but groans, screams, and plops. You get the picture. The press are kind of quite confused and baffled. It's not a negative review, but it's one that shows extreme kind of ignorance of this subject, and it sort of illustrates the kind of general zeitgeist around. It sort of shows what a obscure field electronic music still was in the UK in the late 1950s. With these small successes, and as well as there being a kind of attitude in the BBC management that, yes, in a way, they wouldn't have said, yes, Daphne Oram is right, but they would have said, yes, it's true, we must keep up with Europe and America. Okay, so they did eventually create an electronic sound studio called the Radiophonic Workshop, and Daphne Oram and this chap here with the bald head, Desmond Briscoe, were the first two. They were called technicians, not composers, but they were the first two technicians to work in that workshop. And they had another chap who was called Dickie Bird, which is a great name, and he was responsible for the sort of maintenance of the equipment. So this small team of three with some old second-hand equipment started to produce soundtracks for radio and TV at the BBC. But because they were classed as technicians and not musicians or composers, they didn't receive any credit for their work. And at this point, Daphne Oram had kind of got quite frustrated with certainly with the lack of credit, but also she was very frustrated in that the Radiophonic Workshop was a studio which, like a jobbing studio, okay, so it was every commission had a short deadline, a specific brief. It was all very everything was for ATV or radio production, very tight, quick deadlines, and so on. The combination of this, lack of opportunity for real musical research, which obviously the studios in America and Italy and Germany and Paris, they all had state funding for just composers to come and make electronic music. And Daphne Oram felt passionately that this should also be the case at the BBC, or at least somewhere in the UK. But at the time, this was the only specialist electronic music studio in the UK that was sort of publicly owned. I think there was quite a few people kind of with small studios at home, kind of dabbling, making little pieces and stuff. But this was the only state institution that had an electronic studio. So after 15 years at the BBC, but only 6 months in the Radiophonic Workshop, Daphne Oram left to do her own thing, to follow her own research and try and make a go of being an electronic musician. And so that was 1959. And so she moved to this crazy looking building in Kent, so it's maybe a 2-hour drive from London, so in the countryside. And she built the first she built the first privately owned commercial sound studio electronic sound studio in the UK. 1959, yeah. And the remarkable thing is she's not only the first woman to create an electronic sound studio, like for commercial, a commercial enterprise, but she's the first person in the UK to do that at all. An amazing woman. I actually can't remember what this sound is. I'm going to play it and hope see what it is.
It's Mission Moon for It's Mission Moon for Studs Lego. He's off to pioneer the empty spaces of the moon with Lego, his wonderful building bricks. Build bricks.
Lego build it.
Build Build moon tractor.
Lego build it.
Build missile defense center.
Lego build it.
Lego, the wonderful building toy, builds a whole wide world for you.
Yeah, and so that was one of her early commissions from Lego. So a radio advertisement for the Christmas run and whatever. She also had some other very big clients like Shell Petroleum, British Petroleum, big UK brands, maybe something you won't have heard of so much in Brazil, but certainly anybody in the UK would be familiar with most of the brands she worked with doing commercials. She also did film soundtracks, so the most notable being Jack Clayton's The Innocents, which is a version of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. And she also worked closely with a director called Jeffrey Jones, and they made these short films that you would have, before the main feature in the cinema. So, and they made them about all kinds of things, but two of the best ones are Trinidad and Tobago. So they went to Trinidad and Tobago and made a documentary about that with the carnival and very early incarnation of carnival and everything. There's amazing recordings in the Daphne Oram archive from there. And also this other film, Snow, which is on YouTube, you should watch as well. And it's a film about trains in the snow in England. It's a sort of information film. It was supposed to be about the post office and how they get all of the mail through the train system, but it was the coldest winter for years and years and years, and there was so much snow that the film ended up being about snow, really. So there's just all this, but it's an amazing film in terms of what Oram does with the sound. It has a pop song called Teen Beat by Sandy Nelson. I don't know, it's like a popular musician at the time, and he was a drummer, and it's very kind of it's drums and guitars and rock and roll. But Oram managed to filter the sound so that the drums sound like the train. You can imagine so it sounds like a steam train. So that's an amazing film. And around this time as well, like the early 1960s, she was also giving lecture tours and talking to all kinds of societies and universities and talking about electronic sound. So she was really making a name for herself, and in the mid-1960s she was a famous personality. Like, it's a misconception that she was kind of this obscure figure. She wasn't. She was in the public eye, she was on the radio, she was on TV, but unfortunately subsequently, like, nobody bothered to keep her place in history, right? The people writing history didn't. They just let her fall into obscurity to some extent. So I'm just going to go back a little bit. So this was like the context of where she was at in the early 60s. But if we go back to her later years at the BBC, as I was saying, she was studying everything she could about electronic sound, right, and really trying to create she was thinking about new ways to create electronic music, okay, and she really wanted the BBC to support her in this endeavour, and she was talking to physics professors and sound engineers and electronics engineers and trying to get really a system where she could draw sound. So she was inspired by people like Leopold Stokowski and Edgar Varèse, who, so I'm going to just put a little quote here from Edgar Varèse. If you are curious to know what such a machine could do that the orchestra with its man-powered instruments cannot do, I shall try briefly to tell you. Whatever I write, whatever my message, it will reach the listener unadulterated by interpretation. It will work something like this. After the composer has set down his score on paper by means of a new graphic notation, he will then, with the collaboration of a sound engineer, transfer the score directly to this electric machine. After that, anyone will be able to press a button and release the music exactly as the composer wrote it, exactly like opening a book. So Oram was reading this kind of theory in, the 1940s, but this idea was like from the 1920s and 30s, really. As soon as electronics became a sort of industry and a profession, people started to think about how you could make music with it. Okay, and there are some very early electronic instruments from the 1920s and 30s, but the thing I want you to take from this is this idea of a kind of universal interface that Varese is sort of aiming towards, and Daphne Oram very much took this to heart, and this is what she wanted to do. And in the archive there are like lots and lots and lots of her drawings of how she proposes to create this drawn sound machine, and lots of different ideas that she throws about and talks to her colleagues about, and so on and so forth. So, but after she left the BBC, she, as well as doing all of this other work to support herself, she was trying very hard to get some funding to support this machine she wanted to make. And in 1962, after some long conversations with the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, which is a Portuguese cultural enterprise fund, she managed to get them to give her £3,500 sterling, which I guess, to put in context, it would be similar to what you might receive for a funded PhD now. Yeah, so it would enable her to live and have some small money to buy parts and so on for about 3 years. Yeah. And this got a lot of attention, a lot of press. The TV came to her studio and filmed her like making sounds with her tape decks and all this stuff. But at this point in 1962, she still didn't really know how she was going to create this machine. So she employed her brother, John, and he made a kind of mechanical framework for this electromechanical machine. And she employed an engineer called Fred Wood, who worked at the post office, and he was doing the electronics for automating the telephone exchanges. Do you see what I mean? So instead of jack plugs, they had relays, and so he worked on that. And at the beginning, the progress was quite slow, and although Daphne Oram had a lot of ideas of what she wanted the machine to do, she didn't have like a very precise notion of how technically it would work. And the sort of turning point came later on, I think in 1963, when she met an engineer called Graham Wrench. Well, she met him for the second time and employed him to take over doing the electronics for this machine. And the two of them struck up a very close working relationship, and they would stay up late into the night discussing how this machine might come together. But in the end, they had this idea, well, Oram had this idea already of sort of reversing an oscilloscope. So instead of like sending a sound into a microphone and seeing the pattern on the screen, she wanted to draw something and have it be read and turned into the sound. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And this is the drawing from her patent for this optical sound reading device. So it's quite a simple thing. It's actually quite easy to create if you have an oscilloscope and a light sensor and a little bit of electronics. It's quite easy to recreate this thing. So it reads the waveform essentially, so that you send a triangle, like a sawtooth wave, to the x-axis, so it repeatedly scans horizontally, and then with the feedback, with the feedback circuit, it reads the contour of your drawing, and then so the y-axis becomes your electronic signal to create the sound. So you can draw any waveform, and therefore any timbre you want. Okay, and this document here is the closest thing I've found in the archive to a kind of complete technical brief or specification for the what became the Oramics machine. So she says, written sound waves, January 1961, so this is just before she gets the well, about a year before she gets the grant, the money. She says it needs to have complete control of timbre, pitch, dynamics, vibrato, reverberation, attack and decay, and timbre changes within the note. And it needs to control these characteristics in a visual form so that all alterations within the aural comprehension of the human ear and mind have an easily recognizable counterpart in the visual medium. And 3, to achieve this controlled complexity of waveform whilst keeping all parameters within the scope of written waveforms. And 4, most importantly, to obtain sounds which are more musical than those so far achieved by electronic devices and which have a far greater range of timbre. Yeah? So that's her kind of when I was studying what she achieved with her machine that she built, that was kind of what I was using as my benchmark to see how successful she was. Yeah, I was comparing it to that brief. That was the kind of closest thing we have to a design specification. But going back to the kind of Varesian notion of a universal interface, okay? Oram was working in the early 1960s, and at this time other interests were kind of coming along within electronics and experimental sound. There's 2 main things, was computer-generated music. We had machines like push-button Bertha, which could analyze pop songs and spit out new ones, okay? And we had also like aleatoric music, so chance-based music, like John Cage and this sort of thing. And Daphne Oram remained committed to this Varesian universal interface where the composer has all the control and is freed from the orchestral interpretation, okay? And so she was very opposed to this chance-based music and computer-based music. And this note from, so this is a note she wrote to her colleague Douglas Lilburn, who was a composer based in New Zealand. I'll just read you a little portion of the letter. In the end, our school of thought might win this battle too. Meanwhile, here in London, the ICA, that's the Institute of Contemporary Art, are mounting a big exhibition called Cybernetic Serendipity, costing a mint of money, lots of money. Everything to be strictly aleatoric, so that's me ruled out. A friend of mine defines aleatoric as any old how, and I expect these computer works of art, she has it in quotation marks, will emphasize that definition. I wonder how long it will be before people become bored by chance art and the pendulum swings the other way. So she's very opinionated about these new things. And this is the cover of the catalogue for that. And this became an iconic exhibition in the UK. It was like the first survey of kind of cybernetic art, computer-based art, and it had like Nam June Pak and all kinds of like amazing people who went on to have big careers. But I just, to be fair to Daphne Oram, I just want to play you a bit of this music that she was so cross about, so angry about. Okay.
The occasionally friendly.
Anyway, that's a piece of music by I've forgotten the name, but it was a bit of music that came out of Bell Laboratories in America, which was a highly funded institute with all kinds of experimentation going on. And that was a colleague of Max Matthews, who obviously went on to be the really famous one. I forgot the. Oh, I think it's Dr. R.J. Pierce. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, yeah. Do you know? Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that context because in a minute I'll play you what the Oramics machine sounded like, and yeah. But before that, I just want to explain. So, from 1962 to 1966, Oram was like putting everything she could into building this graphic score machine. Okay, so in 1966 she had some kind of a working prototype at the end of her funding period, and then by about 1967-68 she had sort of finessed it enough to sort of do press photos and show people and have people listen to it and so on. So I'll just show you through the elements of the machine which she built. So this is her working on the machine. I think this is a press photo from 1968. But as I said, the first thing, if you wanted to create some music with this machine, is you draw the timbres you want to work with on these glass slides. Okay. And then you put them in this very weird looking device. It's like a sideboard. I think someone spotted the design and wrote to the Science Museum, and they think it's the casing from an old turntable. Yeah, you know, like I forget what the word is, but where the turntable's like got the speaker and stereogram, I guess. Or, yeah. So you would put the glass slides into these things here. So there's 4 cathode ray tubes, CRT monitor, like scanning spots basically, and up here inside it is the main fundamental oscillator behind these tubes in the back there, and on top is the pitch control circuitry which allows you to program the note of that fundamental oscillator. Okay, and then this part is the programmer where you draw the score basically, and it had 10 synchronized 35mm film tracks. Yeah. In fact, she ended up only using 9. Like I said, it was a little bit chaotic, the process of building this machine and having 3 engineers and her and all her ideas and them trying to interpret and make the thing. So she ended up only using 9 of the tracks. So I'll just explain what they did. These top 3 tracks here were a sort of codified digital pitch control, and this so depending on the combination of dots, it would tell you how high or low the oscillator should be. This wavy red line here is the vibrato or pitch bend control. So that's the analog pitch control where you can make it go between the notes, and you can go doo, whatever, like the moving your hand on the cello, and then so that whole section is for the pitch control, and then there are 5 volume envelope controls. Okay, so they're telling you how loud each of the 4 oscillators will be, and remember each oscillator has potentially a completely different sound, so you can mix anywhere between those 4 oscillators. And then the last one, in fact I can't remember, I think it changed at times. The machine was sort of never a static entity, she was always changing and developing and fiddling with it. But one of the 5 tracks is the reverberation, so it takes the mix of the other 4 and sends it to a reverb chamber, which was an old oil tank in her house with a speaker and a microphone, and then back into the mix. Okay, so it was like an aux send on your mixer basically, but that's what she did with an old oil tank, and it sounded amazing. So it's a very strange machine, and like it was on display at the Science Museum, and I was like going in at 6 in the morning before the museum opened and getting into the display cabinet in just my socks and sort of prodding it with a multimeter and seeing where the wires go. And it's in the condition it's in now, it's incredibly chaotic, and there's a lot that's been added over time but nothing taken away. So like all of the early bits of technology are still there, but then some of them are just sort of like ripped out. They're just like a pile of wire, and new sensors have been put in, or so it was always this machine that was in flux. And in the archive there are 3 big volumes of Oram's technical diaries, which go through the whole history of her progress trying to make this machine work and so on. And it's like there was a lot of ups and downs, but she did make some amazing sounds with it. And this is her diagram of what I've just described, basically, from her book, which she wrote in 1972, called An Individual Note of Sound, Music and Electronics. And that's available on UbuWeb for free as a PDF, and it's also been re-released as a hard copy which you can buy, so I do encourage you to read it. It's a really very strange book, but it's an amazing read. It's very kind of new age, lots of philosophy and the combination, lots of philosophical references to electronics and humanity and parallels between. It's a very weird and interesting book, but anyway, the last chapter is her describing the Oramics machine that she built. So now I'll just play you a little clip from the Oramics machine, and this is a nice clip because Daphne Oram loved reverb. So there's very few recordings of this machine that aren't totally swamped in reverb, okay? But in this one we get a little hint of what it sounded like on a dry recording. Yeah. So this is from a radio interview she did in 1971 on the BBC. So it was a current affairs show, feature magazine show called The World at One.
Well, I was wanting to make some sort of trumpety sounds, but not exactly a trumpet. One doesn't want to copy sounds of normal instruments. And so I drew a wave pattern, and I gave that to the machine, and then I went and put some black dots on. Now this just gives me a number of pitches, one after the other. Let's hear those. Very dull. Now we want to put vibrato, and we want to put reverberation, and we want to rephrase it and make it much more musical.
Yeah, so when I first heard it, I was astonished at the sort of musicality of it, compared to other 1960s electronic instruments and 60s computer music and so on. Obviously there's some amazing iconic works in that field, but I think when she says she wants to make a machine with this real musicality where you can express real feeling in those notes, I think she really achieved that. And she knew as well how important it was. She wasn't demure and shy about saying, I think I've got the best machine in the world. She really believed that. And she was in touch with all of these different laboratories worldwide who were all developing, so she was in touch with the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Lab, where they had the RCA synthesizer. She knew about the ANS synthesizer in Russia that was featured on the Solaris, the Tarkovsky films. And she was just aware of all that was going on. And she wrote these amazing letters to her funding body, to the Gulbenkian Foundation, saying, yeah, they're trying, but they haven't caught up with me yet. So she knew how important her work was. But it wasn't an easy process, and as I said, she had a lot of problems with using this machine. She had a lot of things going wrong, and to compound these problems, in 1966, just as the machine was coming to the point where it was a working prototype, she fell out terribly with both her brother John, who had done the mechanics, and Graham Wrench, who had done the electronics. And so from that point on, she was not in touch with them anymore. And they had a kind of fundamental role in building this machine. So these technical diaries from kind of 1966 to about 1972 are kind of tragic to read, like, and the machine didn't have a huge output. It had, you know, like in I think 2007 a double album of Daphne Oram's works was released, and there's maybe only 2 or 3 or 4 pieces on there which actually are the Oramics machine. And she also had bigger plans for the Oramics machine to be able to have an integrated, synchronized multi-track tape recorder, so that she could write one line of melody and then scoot back and then write another one, so she'd be able to do harmonies and chords. And that unfortunately never happened either. And here's just sorry. Here are just a few photos of sort of like the machine through the early prototype to how it looked sort of in the early 70s. So this one, you can see the pitch controllers on the nearer tracks. So at some point she scrapped that and changed it and put them. So I think this is from about 1966. This is the publicity shots she used for the book, like taken late 60s, 68, 69 I think. And then this is early 70s where she has the machine in loops here. And this, when they found the machine, there was a blue plastic broom handle with it, and no one knew what it was for. And then someone who had known Daphne Oram and had visited her studio sent me this photo, and I was like, that's what the broom handle is for. It's for the loops. But anyway, but you'll notice, well, I'll point it out, but on this later incarnation of the machine, the envelope shapes, the volume controls are like filled in graphs. Do you see what I mean? And they were with, so what she did at some point around 1970, she completely changed the technology which read the lines, because the initial analog volume reading machines worked in the same way as the oscillators. They had a tiny CRT, but with a still spot that would follow the contour with the same feedback mechanism and create that voltage to control an amplifier. But she couldn't keep it working, especially with Graham Wrench gone, who'd made it. So she changed it to this much simpler system where it was just a light sensor, and so that meant you had to fill in the graph. So it made the process more difficult and more time consuming, and she was like using black electrical tape instead of ink, and so it was like going further from her vision. Do you see what I mean? So yeah, it's kind of quite sad, because she wasn't able to get more support for keeping this machine going, and obviously at the same time electronics and electronic music is really developing very quickly around the world. Okay, so but Oram obviously knew all of this, so yeah, these are that's the so this was my conclusions about the machine. So it was ambitious, holistic and nuanced approach, but in practice it was pretty unreliable, it was ungainly and big, and she couldn't transport it to anywhere else. It was overcomplicated, like there was so many people involved in making it, and there was so much added and so little taken away that it's and it had quite a limited musical output, but it sounded amazing. And that was I can play you some more later, but she was aware obviously of all of this, and she tried to get more support to build a smaller version of the machine, right, a Mark II, which she called Mini Oramics. And early on in my PhD research, I found this pretty almost complete kind of set of plans for this Mini Oramics, which I don't think was ever finished. We're not 100% sure, but I don't think she ever got a working Mini Oramics. But sort of the stars aligned, and it turned out that this Mini Oramics design was kind of very much in the sort of technology that I was quite familiar with, and I thought, well, I could try and build that, you know. And like I said, the plans were fairly complete. There's about 10 pages. This is the first page with a sort of overview, but obviously like the move from having 10 film strips to one wider strip makes a lot of sense, much easier, like a pianola roll instead of like 10 cans of film that you have to sync. and there's lots of improvements. But yeah, so I, having to do this in the framework of a PhD, I had to find a kind of methodology and a kind of reasoning to, you know, say why I was going to build this machine, not just because I want to and it's cool. So I came up with basically this sort of what if question. What if a significant commercial interest had taken on and perfected mini-Oramics and released it as a product in the 1970s, early 1970s? So this was kind of my main research question and reasoning behind trying to build this machine. And so it was, I pretty much, like the way I'd phrased the question and pretended to be this, a Roland or a Korg or a Moog, trying, you know, like I was taking her idea, her vision, but I didn't try and build the authentic replica according to her design, because I had sort of read through that design and made a critique, and I thought there was a lot of room for improvement still. So I sort of prioritized having a machine that would work and would be reliable and hopefully still keeps within her vision, but so I kind of reimagined the mini Oramics. And yeah, I don't really need this slide because it's sitting right here. But so once, yeah, I finished that in 2016. Obviously, I've still, like Oram, I've been tinkering with it and fiddling with it ever since and trying to make small improvements, but I essentially finished it in 2016. And it was really exciting because lots of people had been really interested in Daphne Oram's legacy, and so it got quite a lot of attention. It was on the BBC. I took it to Moogfest, and so it's been really good for me, but also I hope for Daphne Oram's legacy, because we can, I mean, I feel like having created it and it works, and then you can kind of think, well, if I was in 1973 and I didn't have a home computer and I didn't have MIDI and I wanted to, you know, how would I go about making electronic music? And actually this would have been an amazing tool at that time. Do you know what I mean? So this slide is just all the really nerdy comparative information, which we can like maybe take a photo of it or whatever, or I can come back to it later. But this is one of the first pieces that a composer made for the mini Oramics. It's just a little experiment I'll show you, and it's a version of Horizon by Messiaen, which is a piece originally for Ond Martineau. I don't know if you know about the Ond Martineau. Anyway, so this was my colleague James Bully, who's actually the Oram archivist at Goldsmiths, but also a sound artist and a musician. So this was a piece he made for. Is it going to work? So it's just, that was just a really early little experiment that was done with it, and so yeah, that's kind of the story. I'll go into a couple of more things, but my conclusions are basically that if Daphne Oram had the support she needed, and if Oramics had been brought to market in the early 1970s, I think it could have had a significant impact in electronic music studios around the world. It would have been a lot cheaper than a computer, which was still about the same price as a house in 1972, but much more expensive than something like a Mini Moog or a VCS3. But obviously it has this whole sequencing capability that they don't have. So it has the interface and sound are unlike any contemporaneous technologies, and pretty much unlike any contemporary technologies. And it's actually the one thing I was worried about when I was building this thing was like, is it going to be really annoying to work with? I thought it might be so painstaking, but actually, like, people who are trained musicians who understand like a piano keyboard and scales and whatever and dynamics and rhythm, usually take about a day, and they're writing something that sounds like music. So it's actually not that hard of a learning curve, and in a bit you can have a go. So that's it. But just sort of as a addendum, like at the end, I'd just like to point out that Oram didn't give up. She carried on working until ill health failed, until her health failed. And this is her. She didn't make mini Oramics, but she did learn in her, I think, late 50s, early 60s. As an older woman, she completely learnt to code computers. She bought a home computer. She created Oramics for that computer. She built her own bespoke audio interface before you could just go to the shop and buy an audio interface, which she commissioned from a local electronics engineer. So she never stopped. It was amazing. And going back to the I'm going to come back to that. The still point piece that she wrote in 1948. Last year, Shiva Fesherecki and James Bully, who I already mentioned, had the world premiere of that piece at the Royal Albert Hall for the proms. So that was a really lovely moment for Oram's legacy. And then this, I just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of how, obviously, female pioneers are talked about and looked at by people. And just to point out that kind of, I guess, like how people look back at these legacies. And obviously people are very enthusiastic about rediscovering this history and these amazing achievements. But obviously everybody brings their own sort of agenda to the table. So I think lots and lots of people have approached me for sort of interviews or like to get my opinion or to talk about Daphne Oram, and they seem to fall into roughly two camps. There's like DIY synth people who like really into the like knobs and switches and nuts and bolts of it all, and then there's people who are sort of really interested in the fact that she's a female pioneer and looking at it from more of a sort of a feminist angle. And I think because Oram had such she had such a broad practice, like I haven't scratched the surface of all the things she was researching and looking at. I'm only covering this one specific angle of her life, which is the Oramics machine, and the progress there. But she was also, a teacher, a researcher into lots of different fields. She was very into sort of new age thinking. She was into the occult. She was into archaeoacoustics before there was a term archaeoacoustics, all of this stuff. So just to, obviously I've brought my quite nerdy technical knowledge to sort of bear on this, and I'm obviously presenting it from a certain angle, but I think the more people that can bring the different aspects of her life together, the more people. So I'd encourage any of you to go and look at her other work and research and look at that. And I have a contact for the just to say, I don't think she would have liked being called the unsung pioneer of techno. She didn't like pop music. She liked Schubert and classical music, and she was not into pop really. And she didn't make any techno. Delia Derbyshire arguably made something a little bit like techno, and there is like from really like early on, like in the 60s, something that sounds quite techno-ish. But anyway, that's the end. Thanks. And those are some links. So that's my email, my music, those two. Some more info about the mini Oramics, and this is the contact if anybody wants to get in touch with the Daphne Oram archive at Goldsmiths. If you're ever in London, I really recommend you go and have a look. It's enormous. There's thousands and thousands of pages and boxes of material, and it's a it's an amazing resource just on the whole subject of 20th century music technology, really, and because she kept every like magazine, and so as her personal notes and effects and stuff are really fascinating, but there's also this other side to the archive, which is just like everything to do with computer music, electronic music and stuff through the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, so it's amazing. How are we doing for time? Sorry, I promised to talk slow and I talk fast. Does anyone have questions before I'll show you the machine and we'll let you have a go drawing, but should we, whilst you're still seated, is there any questions?
I do have a couple of questions. Just two questions. One is about the archive. What is the archive? What kind of, its only personal belongs, or she has?
It's very
from that period of time where she was at BBC.
Yeah, she kept all her. So there's lots and lots of her technical notes from the BBC, and there's also in the BBC archive. There's also lots of stuff pertaining to Daphne Oram and the early inception of the radiophonic workshop, and it was interesting to see, from the BBC side, all of these meeting minutes and notes about what are we going to do about electronic music, like it's that sort of thing. But and Daphne Oram kept copies of everything from that period, everything that she was privy to, everything that she was allowed to see. But in fact, they didn't treat her really like an equal at the BBC, and a lot of the pertinent meetings about, basically what was to become her department, the radiophonic workshop, she wasn't allowed to go to these meetings. They would sometimes read out her requests in the meeting or whatever, but she wasn't, included. But in the Daphne Oram archive is now at Goldsmiths University in London, and it's got 600 quarter-inch tapes. It's got I don't know how many thousands of pages of her personal notes and research and drawings and thoughts on everything. All of the working progress towards the book she wrote, other essays that she went and researched and wrote about other subjects, and it's also got photographs of her whole life, the trip to Trinidad and Tobago when she was running around as an 8-year-old girl in the garden. It's got all of that stuff. She kept everything, and it's also, like I said, it's got her more general research of corresponding with university departments and places like Bell Laboratories, and all of anyone who would talk to her about electronic music who knew something about it, she was writing to them and having exchanges and sending tapes back and forth across the Atlantic, and so all of that stuff's there. So it really is, it's an amazing archive.
There's a permanent exhibition. It's an archive you can visit.
I think anyone who shows an interest is allowed to go. Yeah, you have to go by appointment and whatever. But I think it helps if you have an academic affiliation. But I don't think it's closed off per se. I think if you said I'm really interested in this, then anyone could go. But they don't share much material online. I don't know why they don't share a lot of the. It'd be nice if just the digitizations of the tapes were available and stuff, but it's sadly not. This is partly because some of the money they get from selling the records and stuff is how they support the archive and the kind of thing. So it's understandable, but it's sometimes a bit frustrating. So if you're, we've had researchers come from as far as Australia to the UK to look at the archive, and it obviously would have been nice if they could have just gone online. But
And you mentioned some reference like Varese and Schiffer, but and Columbia Princeton, but not Xenax,
Yeah.
who made something quite similar, more or less at the same time. Because
At Oram, yeah.
they have that machine where you could draw lines.
Yeah, yeah. I shamefully haven't done very much research about Xenakis and the U-pick, so that's the reason I haven't brought it up. It's obviously pertinent, but I would say as well that it's when we talk about the origins of Oramics and the sort of Varesian notion, it's quite, when she was starting to design this machine, it's quite a long time before the U-pick. Okay, so it's sort of the U-pick certainly would have been sort of in competition with this in a way, but again that didn't have a commercial release, so it wasn't, you had to go to Oram and it was an institutional thing, whereas this actually could have been in every university music studio quite easily, so it's, I think that's my takeaway from like what she was trying to do. She was really into teaching people music through this method. She wanted her market for this machine to be universities and schools and places where students would learn about the sort of physics of music through drawing. But yeah, I am fairly ignorant about Xenakis and U-pick, so apologies for that.
Oh.
But yeah, yes.
When you show that diagram of the signal flow going to the reverb,
Yeah.
You said that diagram is inside a book featuring weird philosophical speculations, mixing new age philosophy and electronics and stuff.
Yeah.
Do you know anyone working on this material, like reading these speculations?
There's a researcher in the UK called Dan Wilson, he's written a piece for The Wire magazine, I think in 2011, which I could probably send you. I think I have a PDF, and it's all about her family and like how they all have these quite esoteric interests and believe in ghosts and telepathy and stuff like that. So yeah, that's probably the best thing to read if you're interested in that angle. But I would also say that like some of Oram's family are still alive and they're not like mega into that being.
Okay.
I think they were a bit cross about that article in The Wire. I'm not sure, maybe they weren't, but I think it's not they want to be promoting more the music tech and the female pioneer side, I guess. But it is an interesting article. I can send it through to Fernando and you can share. Yes.
Do you know if she made a soundtrack for some of Beckett's plays in BBC?
It's certainly possible. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think it's quite likely.
At the same time?
Yeah. The two that stick in my mind are the first two, which was the two I mentioned, because they were, it's important that, the first electronic soundtracks broadcast by the BBC were both made by this woman, and that's not so that's the point I always push. But I think it does sound familiar. I think it's quite possible that she did work on those. Yeah, in the BBC archives. The thing is to remember is it's 4 or 5 years since I was looking at a lot of these archives, and I haven't been revising it kind of. But there is. It's very interesting looking at the list of the early works from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, and it's also when you look at the sort of 20 or 30 first works that they produced in the records, Daphne Oram is responsible for about 80% of them. And this, I forgot to mention this, and I still always want to mention it, so I'm just going to go back a sec. But this guy, Desmond Briscoe, who's leaning over, he's really culpable for Daphne Oram being forgotten from history, because in the mid-80s, he and another chap, I forget the name of, wrote the history of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, and they barely mentioned Daphne Oram, even though it maybe would have never have happened without her, or not in the same way. So it's yeah, bad Desmond Briscoe. But anyway, So I don't know for sure, but it's quite possible.
In the construction of this device, do you use the same optical device
that she used?
Or you adapted from the scanner?
No, I built it from scratch. There's no like repurposed. It's all. So my because I was trying to answer this question, what if blah blah blah. I didn't use like 1970s microchips, but I did use only technologies which would have been available at that time, because otherwise it doesn't prove anything, right? So I only used digital logic gates, operational amplifiers, and the sensors are phototransistors, which were just coming out around that time. I think light-dependent resistors would be a much slower response. You wouldn't be able to do like busy, fast pieces. They would still work, but you would have to so phototransistors and photodiodes are much quicker. So I use phototransistors. But yeah, I mean, and everything in this machine was possible in 1972. It might have been a bit bigger, like the circuit boards might have had to have been like maybe twice as big, but the technologies are all stuff you could have used at that time. Yeah.
And how difficult was to?
Oh my God.
To get Sorry.
It was very difficult. Trying to turn drawn with a felt tip pen into logical electronic signals is very difficult, I found. Like just the bit of like interpreting the drawings and turning it into control voltages took me months. And it was really, but one day I just had a eureka moment, and then I worked out and I made a test circuit for my new eureka moment, and it worked, and I was like, thank God. And then the rest of it is not. The rest of it, that's the real thing that I've really invented in it, like that way of interpolating the drawings. The rest of it is kind of pretty much standard fare in analog synthesis circuitry and so on. And the reverb is just a dope for modular spring reverb that I've, like I didn't worry too much about like designing an oscillator when there's like a design available, but that bit of reading the drawings was very difficult and took a long time. Yeah. Should I play you something on it?
Yes.
Yeah. Or is there more questions? I'll play you something. I've got 3 pieces here with me. I don't know how much time do we have? It'd be nice if people can have a go. We've got about 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, we'll see. There's 3, was it 3?
3.
Right. And if you want to get up and look closer, feel free.
E se projetar? É só mudar o chave do...
Porque não vai caber todo mundo lá.
Mas a gente pode separar. Dá a volta.
As pessoas me atropelam e ficam na frente, normalmente foi ótimo. Deu tempo.
Não, só se mudar lá. Não precisa ficar.
You can also, if I pull this out, you can stand behind as well. Can you mute the laptop? And I'll just.
No, the
laptop.
Acho que esse aqui não.
And just so I can do that, and then people can, if you're careful, you can come here as well. And on the back it shows you. should I just quickly explain the parameters first? So you can try and see what's happening as it goes. So the first parameter between here and here is 1 octave of 12-tone pitch, like a 1 octave of a piano keyboard, and you can see the black notes. The next one is octave, so that's like where you situate that up or down. And then it's got 2 timbres, which you can control on the front of this machine with these slidey controls. So it has a volume for each one, and then it has the reverb volume, and then it has this vibrato or pitch bend function as well. So that's if you were to like do a vibrato on a note, you'd start in the middle, go up, wobble, and then back to the middle, and then it would so that's basically it. So this piece is not very good. It's a work in progress. It's me experimenting with trying to make a sort of a copy of an English folk tune called Go Your Way, My Love, and it's a really beautiful song that was brought back by Anne Briggs and Bert Jansch, and I thought I would try. I didn't play it at the concert, but this is a work in progress, but the piece afterwards is a bit more finished. Oh, it's very fast. We don't have sound now. Is it?
Sure.
Is that, yeah, that
No,
sounds
no.
Wasn't it 3?
3.
Yeah. Right, there's the beginning. It's just fiddle with the sound a bit. Yeah. I've got it here. That's as far as I got with that one. But anyway, it's I recommend you listen to the original. It's much better. I'll just fast forward through and get to the other piece. So this next piece I kind of perform a bit more. Starts off slow. So this was from about a year ago, a bit more, maybe a year and a half. I actually don't find a lot of time to make new works for this because I live in London. It's expensive. I'm just always working, but yeah, this was a little paid residency which we did. So we had me and Shiva Fesharecki, Sarah Anglis, James Bully, and myself all had like about a week each, like where we could. So this was what I made. Can we we have it a little bit louder on the, not on the channel, but on the output? Structural notes, so you can mark out your rhythm or blah blah blah, and you could draft something and then you fill it in black. So the pink pen is useful. Sorry? Yeah, like exactly, yeah. Comments and notes and stuff. Yeah. So the next piece is based on another another female pioneer called Hildegard von Bingen, and it's a sort of reworking of her piece O Frondins Virga, which is a beautiful like chamber music. I don't know what's the term. You can tell me. What do you call that kind of like plain song, like chanting? Yeah, and it was performed originally with an opera singer. I don't have him with me. But anyway, but it sort of works on its own as well.
It was your idea to bring Hildegard?
It wasn't my idea, no. A friend of mine, another amazing musician and researcher called Wando Ibizi, she got some funding so that a group of us could do a kind of collective piece based on the work of Hildegard von Bingen. So yeah, I'd never heard of them. So it was thanks to Wando, my friend, that we did that. And we had so we had a residency at Opera North in Leeds, and then we had another performance at King's Place in London.
Good friend.
She's great. She's awesome. She looks like a female Sun Ra. She looks nice. Yeah, she's brilliant.
She has been doing a residency in museums with us.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, you know her, don't you? I forgot, Joe. Yeah. It's a bit fiddly. Like I said, it's better with the opera singer. If you're wondering about the bits of string, it's initially we had terrible problems with static electricity. And it would go just stick. Yeah, so now the surface has these little holes, and there's a gentle breeze that blows up, and then the string is like the world's most expensive string. It's like used for production lines and stuff to combat static electricity. And it wasn't enough on its own. I had to make the sort of air hockey. So. That's where I tune it. We good? Yeah. it doesn't really like the Brazilian voltage. It's a bit like it just puts everything out a little tiny bit.
You have in UK 240.
Yeah, 240. Yeah, so
for regular.
Well,
voltage.
It's like 235 to 245. It wouldn't, yeah. But it seems like it's close, but sometimes no cigar. Myself. But let's try again. Let's see if it's. these are the volumes of the two timbres, so they're just going warm, like.
And the other one?
So here is melody and octave, and this one is reverb.
I've lost the final the best.
Yeah.
And this one is actually is another thing I couldn't resist putting on the machine, but it's like the drum tracks. I can plug it into my modular synthesizer and make Oramics techno. A total addition from Daphne Oram's original specification, but I couldn't resist it. So it's like here.
So she was the unsung voice of techno.
I was the I turned her into it.
Yeah, we've got a question from Vanessa.
Okay.
Hi Tom.
See?
So nice to see you.
I can't because I didn't bring it. Oh, hey Vanessa.
Yes.
Am I there?
Written down.
Yeah, it's a message.
Cool.
So, I have a question for you unrelated with Daphne. It's okay. If it's okay. It's very small letters. Unless you have spoken about this already, can you please speak a bit about your work life as a sound artist in London, especially related with this career choice in terms of sustainability.
Being able to survive, basically.
Secondly, can you relate that with your women colleagues, counterparts, and their presence in the scene of sound art and experimental music? Yes.
Okay.
Hello.
It's a long, complicated question. So with the first, she can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
With the first question, I suppose I went to art school and graduated and had no means to support myself, and I wasn't a famous artist and so on and so forth, but I've always been kind of quite technical, quite able in that realm, and so I got a job as a trainee sound engineer, and I understood quite a lot about sound from already doing like mixing on computers and making old rave tunes on a computer and stuff like that, and DJing, and so I learned to be a sound engineer. And then when I moved to London, I was lucky and I found some good contacts for getting work in sound engineering. So what I'm getting at is that I've always had this like quite good backup thing where I was able to support myself and do my art, and doing a profession like sound engineering where the money is, 3 or 4 times minimum wage, it allows you more studio time. And then because I'm sort of trained in art, I found a kind of niche doing technical stuff within the art world, with sound and video, 16mm film, and all the time I was developing my practice, and I had a studio, and so I guess that's the takeaway is like try and have a thing that is good money in little time, right? That's why I'm able to still live in London. Loads of my friends have left, and so how did she phrase the question about women working in sound art? Like just talk about them, basically.
Yes.
Can you relate with your women colleagues, counterparts, and their presence in the scene of sound art experiment?
Right. Unfortunately, I think maybe it's still like recently I was asked to do a lecture and performance at a university, and I was like, okay, sounds good. They were going to pay me money, fine, great, everything perfect. And then I got the list of who was taking part, and it's all white men. And so I guess my policy now is to always question that. So immediately I wrote back and said, it's all white men. What do you think about that? But I don't know how strict one should be. But I know so many fabulous, talented women working in sound and music and sonic art. And I think, like, it's maybe sad to say, but I think there's still a point where the ones we know about and the ones who are really getting somewhere, they have to be probably a bit better than the men, right? But, I mean, things are changing. People are much more conscious of this now, and people are, you know, more and more conscious that it's just not acceptable to have an all-male, all-white lineup anymore. But it still happens, so, I mean, I feel like I just try and poke people when it happens, and I don't know, I mean, I should maybe turn down the... What do you think? Should I turn down those gigs? I don't know, it's a discussion, isn't it? I mean, like, I would like to know your thoughts, but in terms of, I mean, I think through the academic route it's better, like the women I know who are doing PhDs and doing research in academia, I think maybe the playing field is more level, but with, you know, festivals and that kind of thing, it's still, especially in the sort of nerdy synth world, you know, like that's really synth meetings, and that's, you know, you go to it's boys and toys, and it annoys me. I don't like going to those things. Like sometimes I get invited to them, but, you know, not to disrespect anyone, I've kind of gone there and done that for, but it does get me down how male dominated it is. But I think also, like, for myself, like, I'm much more aware of all of this stuff since doing this PhD, right? Like, it's like I've changed. It's like, I'm much more conscious of these sorts of things. So I hope that helps to illustrate a bit. But just like there were some fabulous, like obviously fabulous female artists and researchers and technologists, you know, working in London right now, and all power to them. So we'll find some. Have you got more questions online? Okay, cool.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thanks, Vanessa. Does anyone want to have a go? Or is it too late?
No, we have 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Mais perguntas, comentários? Marina.
Can you compose in real time?
You can make a sound drawing in real time, but you can't really like be, you know, because you can't draw the notes and the dynamics. You need to be like. You need to, maybe 3 or 4 people could, if they were really like amazing kind of percussionists, to be like. But it's hard. But you can do like long droney pieces, and sometimes you can make a loop, and sometimes I make a loop and do a kind of noise performance where it's like I start with some very simple motif that I've drawn in advance, and then I draw on it through the thing and make it more chaotic. But I think I'm really interested really in more people who really understand music better than me. I'm not musically trained, creating kind of nice, amazing, beautiful lyrical pieces, rather than like there's so many noise musicians and noise gigs in London. I'm just like, I was just like, I want to have some sweet music, you know, like my own music is much more aggressive than what I've played you on here. It's much more kind of like techno-esque, I suppose, but not, I don't know, it's polyrhythmic and weird, and I can play you some, but it's quite, so I have that and then I have this. So this is more cerebral and
But I have a question about the experience that you have with the composers that you're mentioning.
Oh yeah.
Do you know how they worked? How was the process, or because you have
I worked with
a bunch
them
of things
throughout because I was their technician.
You did together.
Yeah, well, I was their technician, their enabler, and then some of them. Well, actually, that's not true actually, because James and Sarah both after a day with me or whatever, just got on with it and did it themselves more or less. I was around on hand in case they had questions.
Okay.
And Shiva used the sort of expanded technique. So she used the drum tracks and to use to make another. I have this other invention which is voltage controlled turntables.
Oh.
So my synthesizers can make the turntable go fast, slow, forwards, backwards, right?
Oh, okay.
And she's a turntablist, right?
Oh.
So when I told her this, she couldn't resist it. So we did Oramics turntablism with Shiva.
Okay.
So I did have to like help her with all that stuff, but yeah, it was.
Okay.
But like I say, it's not super difficult. The only thing is like you heard like a couple of bum notes sometimes or wrong. It has to be calibrated really every time you transport it, and every time the mains is a bit different, and so we didn't do that today. But so sorry about the bum notes.
It's okay.
Someone wants to try drawing something?
Alguém quer desenhar alguma coisa aí?
We have 10 minutes. Quick. So, do you remember the parameters? Like, so it's melody, octave. Oh, let me just do something first, sorry. I'm just going to put the dots of silence so we can turn the sound on and then not hear anything. I'll just put it at the lowest note to start and then put this up.
Ai. Canal 3.
É o 3, é o 3.
Quando?
Pode levantar, pode subir.
Pode subir tudo?
Pode subir mais.
Não. Aí tá bom? Tá bom.
Ah, seu
Importante.
Okay.
Pode apoiar aqui, ó.
Start wherever you want. Yeah, but yeah, melody usually.
My arm.
Yeah. Well, you should probably start at the left, but it doesn't matter. But it doesn't matter. We can wheel it through. Tiago, have you been getting photos? I asked them to take photos for you.
Oh yeah, no.
You're getting some, yeah?
I get some.
Yeah, cool. Okay.
Does it matter if they are too small or?
I mean, the tiny ones, it's usually pretty good. It'll usually pick them up, but yeah, like the sensors are 3 millimeters, but they're very sensitive. So yeah, usually a little dot will also trigger it, but to be super reliable, you want a nice blob like that. But
Okay.
It doesn't matter, but the way it works is if you put a dot, it stays there until it sees another dot, right? So you don't need to do a line. It won't hurt it, but it should stay where you put it in all of the parameters. So there's two timbres, okay? So you've got timbre A and timbre B that are controlled here. So you've got the volume of A, the volume of B, and then the volume of the reverb. So you don't hear much until it's quite high up. And it's like post fade. Do you see what I mean? So the reverb sounds louder if this is loud and that's loud. Yeah? That's quiet. Yeah. I don't know if it will go to silent, but it will go to the one before. Do some with the other. Do something in. Sorry to be bossy. Okay, you ready? Let's see. Is it everything set up? Yeah, I'll go slow because it's small.
It's monophonic.
Oh, sorry, I didn't have the vibrato switched on for that. We can listen again with the pitch bend, okay? Alright, so again with pitch bend. Whammy bar, you found the whammy bar. Great. Anybody?
The dots for
so melody, so it's like C to B, like 1 octave keyboard. Octave, so 1 is low, 6 is high. And then volume, reverb, volume, pitch bend here. So with this one you start in the middle, go up and down and end in the middle. But you can also just draw a picture of a dog. Whatever.
Melody.
Just for reference, or?
Yeah, just so something. Yeah, because sometimes you might want to do something rhythmic. Yeah, I've got a blank cover as well. The guy I was mentioning, James Bully, he's been making films with it. And he was like, "Can we get rid of the grid?" So he'll draw the composition with the grid. Then I change the top so it's blank, and then he films the lines going through and makes these filmy compositions. Sometimes with it going like up and across and stuff like that. Yeah. But the little bugger, he's never shared them with me.
Oh.
I would have loved to have shown
It's like
you.
McLaren?
Well, I mean, you can imagine. You see the score going through.
Okay.
Just imagine it's like a square film, just with these waves going through. And what he does as well is he delays the sound. So when you see the wave coming on here, that's where you hear it here, instead of that's where it actually reads it in the machine. But it makes more sense for the film. So they're nice. Yeah.
Dois irmãos.
É. E o pitch bend aqui.
You know, Villa Lobos.
Yeah. Ready?